I began exploring ghost towns actually probably about 30 years ago and started doing this with a few friends of ours. And we would get together and go out on these little weekend sojourns, as it were. And one of the things that was interesting was looking into, was actually researching these ghost towns as well and seeing what information that we could find out about them. And the best sources that I found were actually these little township, not even county, but these little township books. And back in 1967, it seems that the government gave a lot of these townships, little grants, probably as a centennial type thing, so that they could write up their histories in these books. And there was a lot of extremely valuable information. I mean, some of it was really quite funny, like, so and so's barn burned down last week, that type of stuff. But there's a lot of very valuable information, and it was interesting to dig up, all these different facts and how these towns came into be, and to be able to categorize them as well. So that was one of the other things that I was able to do. I do have a ghost. I have a ghost towns website if anyone is interested. I'll give out the address at the end of the presentation. So one of the things that I started doing was exploring these ghost towns. And when I started finding pictures of them in postcards, I thought, well, this is just absolutely fantastic. Now I know what my little ghost towns looks like. So, what are ghost towns? Well, ghost towns are former communities that are either now fully or partially abandoned. So a lot of people think of them as towns or places that are full of sagging buildings with doors creaking in the wind and tumbleweeds rolling down the dusty paths. And that's really a Hollywood ghost town. I've never seen anything like that. I wish I would, because it would be extremely photogenic. But many in southern Ontario were small service and supply centers that had a church, a school, possibly a mill, maybe a general store. But the ones that we're going to look at are single industry communities, and those were typically company towns. And for the most part, they were located in remote areas with no nearby amenities or town sites. So, in order to attract workers and their families, these companies had to provide those services. So, in effect, what they had to do was build a small town site for them. So, the three that we're going to look at are Byng Inlet, which was a lumbering community in the Parry Sound region, Creighton Mine, which was a former mining community. It was built by Inco and located in the Sudbury area, and Depot Harbour, which was another company town that was located in the Parry Sound region, and it was a major railway and shipping center. So first one I'm going to do is Byng Inlet. It's first on the alphabet. And also I have the most pictures of Byng Inlet. I have quite a few. I'm not really sure why, but I do. So this is a map showing the area of Byng Inlet. Now, I'm hoping you can see my cursor over here. So Byng Inlet is located on the Georgian Bay. It's about 70 kilometers north of Parry Sound. And the community began in 1868 as one of three mill locations, which you can see here on the map. And it was home to a lumber mill that was built by Anson Dodge and Pulaski Clark. And for some reason, it went through various different identities. It was called Mill Location B, and it was called Upper Village. I don't know why. But anyway, the inlet itself, which this is actually Byng Inlet, came in. It came in off the Georgian Bay, and the community was named afterwards. So Byng Inlet was named after Admiral John Byng. He was born in 1704, and he was court-martialed and executed for cowardice in 1757 following the Battle of Minorca, despite recommendations for leniency. So according to most reports, Byng was poorly equipped. He was vastly outnumbered and had little combat experience. So perhaps naming the inlet after Admiral Byng may have been the British way of making amends for what was very likely a miscarriage of justice. I mean, they hung the poor man. But as recently as the 1990s, his descendants were trying to get his name cleared without success. Elijah Bigwood was kind of the heart and soul of Byng Inlet, as it were. He was an American. He was born in Vermont in 1863. He arrived in Northern Ontario in 1890. And he was active in the community from the very beginning. Now, the Dodge and Clark Mill was destroyed by fire in 1891. And mill fires were pretty common back in those days. In 1897, Bigwood began scouting around the Byng Inlet area for a property where he could build a schoolhouse. The New Holland and Graves Mill was built on the same site as the Dodge and Clark Mill in 1900. It was an extremely modern mill in that it had electricity, which was pretty rare back in 1900. It was named the Graves Bigwood Mill in 1906 after William Elijah Bigwood became the managing partner. Bigwood was one of 5 partners, however, he was the most prominent. Not much is known about the others. So, in addition to scouting for a school site, Bigwood was also responsible for the construction of an Anglican church in the community in 1909. Now, the railway, this was a really big thing because until the arrival of the railway, all shipping was done by steamer, and they had to work fast. Shipping could only take place from April to November. After that, the inlet froze over, and that was it. So the arrival of the CPR in 1908 made a huge difference. Newspapers and mail were delivered daily. Residents could travel to Parry Sound or to Sudbury. Most importantly, lumber could be shipped out daily instead of being restricted from April to November. And steamers were discontinued 6 years later. Here's a couple of nice views of the mill in the early days. The picture on the left is a these are all postcards. So the postcard on the left was a lithograph. It was published by George Moore sometime between 1905 and 1907. He was a Parry Sound publisher, I think. On the right, it's a real photo card, and that is the Graves and Bigwood Mill. And it's, again, I can only go by the stamp boxes because these cards were never mailed. They were not dated. But the stamp box is roughly 1905 to 1910. Now, I mentioned mill fires were common, and yes, indeed, they were. So this was the second of 3 major fires, and this was on May the 20th, 1912. So the mill was hit with a devastating fire that caused an estimated $250,000 in damage. And for a little bit of perspective, that would translate into just under $7 million in today's money. So an estimated 55,000 feet of lumber and 5 million pieces of lath were destroyed in the inferno. But these guys were very energetic, and this mill was rebuilt, and it was up and running a year later. And this is a postcard view of the new mill. I don't have this card in my collection, unfortunately. I lost the auction on eBay. But anyway, this is from the Parry Sound Public Library, and so we can see this nice kind of spanking new mill. Mill buildings, well, there were a lot of other small additional factories that were in addition to the lumber mill. And this was the box factory, which they seem to have been really proud of because it's kind of all over the place here. So this is the box factory in the upper left, and the upper right, we have the sawmill in the box factory. And below that, we have the box factory, the sawmill, and the coal towers. So the box factory was essentially used to construct boxes from the shortcuts and the offcuts of wood. There was also a band mill and a factory that produced lath and wood chips. Mill buildings included a boiler room, a dry kiln, and ice and pump houses, and there was also a small hospital that was required by law. Now, the box factory was later converted into a planing mill, and that was destroyed in another fire in 1922. Now, it is important to note that this mill was the second largest producer of lumber in Ontario at the time, so it was a very prosperous mill for its day. Postcard on the upper left, unfortunately, is damaged. It's too bad. That's the way I got it. I made my choice. I've never seen another copy of it since, and it's a great photo, so I'm happy I bought it. But again, that's a wonderful view of the mill there. And The other one is captioned the horses, and that's kind of interesting. And it might pertain to the teams of horses that were used to haul the lumber over to the railway yards. And again, we have to remember that there were no roads going to Byng Inlet back in those days. You know, if somebody wanted a vehicle, fine, they would have to put it on a flat car and transport it up by train. There was nothing, there were no roads where they could drive it. So horses would have been their only means of transport at the time. Here's a few views of the lumber yards. The picture in the upper right would have been before the second fire, the one in 1912. So that's from about 1908. To the left of that is another view of just the lumber yard stacked up. And to the right of that, that's a photo. And I'm saying it's from about 1913 because it came in a little lot of other pictures that were dated 1913. That particular one wasn't, but it appears to be about the same period of time. And the one above that, again, is likely from about 1915. This is my favorite of all of them. So this is the company general store. Now, what I suspect is that this general store may have been built by the previous mill owners, Dodge and Clark. And I say that because when I was doing some research on it, the description of the Dodge and Clark store matched this description perfectly, and so did the location, which was right on the water. Anyway, it was very common for employers during the early 20th century to provide or sponsor many essential services in remote areas like the store here. And the next closest store would have been in Britt, so they would have had to go across the water to get there. But it's a beautiful looking store. This is workers' housing, which was also provided by the company. The picture on the left I got from one of my website visitors, and I think it was his grandfather's home was what he told me. The company built 105 small homes for workers and their families. The homes were roughly 800 square feet. They were frame buildings on wooden foundations with 200 square foot back stoops. Indoor plumbing was still a luxury in those days, particularly in Byng Inlet, which had existing sewage disposal problems. They had already been fined by public health authorities. And I mean, even back then, there was still public health keeping a watch because they were dumping sewage into the water from the doctor's home of all places. So, ooh, okay. So, anyway, these homes all had outhouses. There were community pumps and wells for each group of homes. The dwellings were all unpainted, but residents were free to add fences, flower gardens. They could spruce them up in other ways to make them feel like home. The company also built a boarding house and a hotel, and in 1900, Bigwood advertised in the Globe and Mail for a manager for one of the boarding houses and for the hotel, and ability to cook was a requirement. There were at least 4 boarding houses, one of which was owned by William Horowitz, who was a popular business owner in Byng Inlet. We'll see a couple more instances of him. Byng Inlet's population hovered in the range of 200 to 800, depending on the season and how busy the mill was. Now, this over here, I'm thinking, and I don't have any confirmation of this, but I'm thinking it might have been one of the managers' homes because the managers' homes were definitely more elaborate than the workers' home. It could have been the doctor's home as well. I really don't know. But it's definitely a much nicer. It's obviously larger and fancier than the workers' homes. The picture on the left of the kids in the sleigh, we've used that one a lot. Yeah, that was a great one. We used it actually on the cover of Car Talk one year. It's a lovely picture. It's from about 1907, and even though it's a lithograph, it's a great view. On the right, we have a real photo card that somebody was, I think maybe they were thinking of publishing this because it's got samples stamped on it. Not very good advertising for Byng Inlet, I don't think. That was Easter Sunday at Byng Inlet. And I guess we can just be glad that it wasn't like that a couple of weeks ago here. So, recreational activities for families included church socials, fundraising events, and of course, sleighing, hockey, and other sports. And for those who preferred more commercialized fare, there was a pool hall owned by our friend William Horowitz. And there was the Royal Theatre, which opened around 1913 to 1914. They featured plays and motion pictures. The movie theater was extremely popular and it was enlarged in 1917. I don't have a postcard of it, unfortunately. Religion was important back in those days. It was kind of the center of the community. Up above, we have the St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, which later became the St. Andrew's United Church. The United Church archives is very detailed, but they didn't have a lot of information on this church, so I'm guessing it just didn't exist. The church was known to have existed as early as 1883, but that's kind of all we know about it. On the right, we have the Church of the St. John the Divine, and that was the Anglican church built in 1909 on land donated by the Mill Partners. So Bigwood and his wife were extremely active in the church. His wife, Clara, reportedly had a very good singing voice. She was active in the choir, and she also did solo concerts for fundraising. And below that, that's a really nice view of the interior of the Church of St. John the Divine. And, it's quite a beautiful church for just a small milling community. They really put a lot of work into that. Now, the mill burned again one last time, and that was in 1922. The financial loss was estimated at $175,000 to $200,000. The following year, 1923, Bigwood was incapacitated by a stroke. He never returned. He passed away in 1927 at the age of 63. So by our standards, he was certainly a relatively young man. With lumber supplies already depleted, the mill closed for good in 1927. Alice Manberts, who was the widow of one of the partners, sold off the remaining properties to the residents in 1933. Now, it wasn't quite over for Byng Inlet yet. These are, well, at the very bottom there, we have, that's a long view of the coal docks and the coal towers for the CPR. That picture is probably from the 1940s. The other two are earlier. The one up above, I think, is probably from the 1920s and had a cute little note on the back of it. It said, those steamers are unloading coal from the Canadian Pacific Railway on the other side of the river. They carry about 8,000 tons and are from 50 to 600 feet long. Not many coming at present as the coal strike is very bad. So this outlet, or this coal and dock outlet, probably stayed in operation until the late 40s or early 50s, by which time the railway had converted over to diesel. So our last view here is the Sawmill Lodge. Now, the Sawmill Lodge was built by William Horowitz, and it was built after 1930. It was built on the site of the former company's store, and that burned down in 1930. So Mr. Horowitz built a new store on that location, and he later moved his post office over there because he was also postmaster beginning in 1931. To the right of that, we have a much later view of the Sawmill Lodge, which is probably from the early 1960s. It's a chrome card. It's from the Peterborough Postcard Company. The Peterborough Postcard Company was owned by Harry Oakman. He was a photographer and also a flyer. He was a superb aerial photographer. So we can see over here, it's kind of interesting. You can still see the cribbing and the water over here, and there's ruins from the sawmill over here. And here is the lodge over here, and this likely dates from the late 50s or the early 60s. Now, Byng Inlet still exists. It's classed as a dispersed rural settlement. The school closed in 1966 and is now a private home. A number of the workers' homes have been upgraded and remained in use either seasonally or year-round. The Sawmill Lodge is still in operation. It is the only commercial business in Byng Inlet today. It's been expanded, and it includes a number of attractive cottages that are available for rental. It caters to fishing enthusiasts, and it offers boat and fishing gear rental. So if you want a vacation in a ghost town, here's your opportunity, folks. Okay, here's just a few other views. These are some more recent views of Byng Inlet. These are, we've got the schoolhouse over here is now a private home. This is one of the workers' homes, which is obviously in need of work. This are remains of the sawmill. There's still quite a few remains there, and here's the cribbing that was in the water, and that is still there as far as I know. Okay, moving right along, we're going to move over to Creighton Mine. Now, Creighton Mine was located about 23 kilometers west of Sudbury. It was opened in 1901 by Inco. And the town was originally named Creighton and was renamed in 1902 when the post office opened. And that was because the name Creighton had already been taken by another Creighton in Simcoe County, which incidentally I think might also be a ghost town. I did an air view of Creighton in Simcoe County, and there didn't really seem to be anything there. So anyway, I don't know. I'll have to check it out, I guess, one of these days. But anyway, okay. Canada, it should be pointed out, is among the top 10 nickel producers in the world. I think we're like number 4 or number 5. So we're right up there. Okay, so here's a couple of early views of the mine and the plant. The deposits were first staked around 1883 by the Canadian Copper Company, which later became Inco. Development began in 1898, and it was followed by the start of mining 2 years later. So in the upper left, this appears to be a very early view of Creighton Mine. So you can see where the shaft was sunk. You can see the plant over here, and there is some housing here, but it seems to be rather scattered. Now, the first shaft was sunk in 1903. It was followed by the second in 1905, and by 1913, the pit stood at 400 feet wide and 190 feet deep, engulfing the first shaft. Now, I don't have years for these. Again, these cards were not mailed, so I could only go by the stamp boxes. There's a very nice view of the plant over here. It's a nice photo. I really like that particular one. Here's a few more views of the plant. So up above in the upper right here, you can see the railway cars here. So they would have been, trucking the ore over to the railway. Below that, we have the rock house, which suggests that there was still copper mining going on there. This one's kind of fun here. It's called Payday. Shows this long lineup of workers waiting to collect their pay packets, which probably came in cash because it was before the days of income tax or anything like that. And over here we have a couple of views of workers. So to the right is a group of miners who were, and that looks like it was taken down in the pit. And to the left we have a group of what looks like painters. I mean, they're all holding paint cans, so I guess that's what they were doing. I like the guy on the left there with the Band-Aid across his nose. No vanity there. But again, nice group photo of the workers. Now here's a few views of the town site. Now this is one that we used when we first announced the presentation. So over here, this appears to be a boarding house over here. And here we have the plant, and again, there's a few scattered dwellings over here. Creighton Mine grew quickly into a well-established town site. So unlike Byng Inlet, most of Creighton Mine's businesses were privately owned. So Inco essentially provided the housing, the infrastructure, and some amenities, but that was it. Now, the first boarding house, which may have been this one, opened in 1902, and it had a good run. It lasted until 1975. And both the mine and the plant in the earlier card can be seen over on the right. Below that, that looks like a very early view of cabins, because those cabins are pretty primitive looking. There's no road. It's basically mud. There's no sidewalks. So I'm guessing that that's probably a very early view, maybe from about 1904 or 1905. So besides the boarding house, early businesses included Kelly's store, there was Gimpoli's barber shop, and a tailor who remained in business for over 50 years. I guess the good residents of Creighton Mine like to be dressed well. Unlike most company towns, medical services for the workers were an essential requirement. So until 1911, miners had to travel to Copper Cliff. Inco then opened a doctor's home and an office, which lasted until 1942, when it was replaced by a more up-to-date building. An additional doctor and nurse were added. By then, the service had been extended to the miners' families, which was generous of Inco during the days of privatized medicine. There was also a dentist and a midwife who was able to assist with uncomplicated births, and prescriptions were dispensed from McGill's drugstore until 1952, when the business moved to nearby Lively, and we'll talk about Lively very briefly a bit later. Again, here are some more town views. These are probably from the 1915 to 1920 period. Um, yeah, these they're interesting. You can see that the community is definitely being upgraded at this point. These buildings look a lot better than those little shacks that we saw in the earlier view. We've got a vehicle here. It still looks like a mud road, but we've got a vehicle over here. And again, here's a few more houses. Now, this has been identified on the back as a Finnish family. So, okay, there were a lot of Finnish people in Creighton Mine. The community was home to a Finnish hall, a boarding house, and a Finnish Lutheran church. So this family looks, they're all dressed up in their Sunday best. You know, maybe they're on their way to church or to some other type of outing, but they're certainly a wonderful looking family. There is some writing on the back, which I have been told is Finnish. I have a Finnish friend. I showed it to him. He doesn't speak Finnish, but he went, yeah, it kind of looks like it could be Finnish. So we're going to say they were a Finnish family, and it refers to the years 1911 and 1912. Now, World War I fueled the demand for nickel in 1915, and so they added an additional shaft, number 3. The number of employees swelled from 540 to roughly 12 to 1,300. As the war ended and the boom and bust cycles passed, production continued steadily at the mine. By 1924, number 3 shaft had reached a depth of 1,900 feet. Number 4, the first underground shaft, was sunk from 1,200 to 2,600 foot level. By the end of World War I, Creighton Mine's population was estimated at 1,700, and there were numerous other businesses. And those included a laundry, several more stores, entertainment venues, a movie house, a pool hall, a shooting gallery, an ice cream parlor. And so this is a later view here of the town site itself, and it's probably from the 1920s, from what I could tell from the stamp box. This looks like it was still a boarding house over here. And this is a view of the business district. Now, the business district had burned down in 1913, but was quickly rebuilt. And we can see that there are now paved roads and sidewalks. So the community has definitely been upgraded. These are kind of fun views. I'm not sure what this is, other than the fact that it's a play. And I got all these cards from the same play, and I don't know, you look at the way they're dressed, I'm kind of wondering if it was a Shakespearean play, but the costumes and the sets are certainly quite elaborate. And these are, again, I'm thinking are roughly in the about 1915 to 1920, about that period. We have a few institutional buildings here. On the left, we have the Fraternity Presbyterian Church, which later became known as the Fraternity United Church. Up above, here is a store, one of the general stores, and when I looked at the signage on the magnifying glass, I could see post office. So that was a post office as well. And below that, we have a schoolhouse, and that schoolhouse was probably built by Inco, because they did provide a few amenities. Now, from 1934 to 1936, number 5 underground shaft was built to a depth of 4,075 feet, while the number 6 was sunk from 3,800 feet to 4,400 feet. There was a slump during the Depression, but military demands began to pick up. And by the 1930s, the population had grown to 2,200, where it remained for the next 25 years. A bank had opened in 1924 and a gas station in 1938. Sports were really big in Creighton Mine. There was a baseball team. It was called the Creighton Cubs, and it was formed in 1911, and they won the championship in the Nickel Belt League 15 times between 1914 and 1959, which I would say is a pretty impressive record. There was one player, and I'm probably not pronouncing his name right, but his name was Phil the Babe Marshall. He was a pitcher and he went on to play in the American Baseball League. In the 1950s, a boxer named Gordon Wallace was inducted into the Canadian Boxing Hall of Fame. And in 1972, another successful athlete was Lucio Fabbri from the Nickel Belt Badminton League, and he qualified for the Olympics. Unfortunately, he never made it. The poor man had to sit it out following an injury. These are a few last looks at Creighton Mine here. On the left, we have an aerial view from air maps, and that's probably from the 1930s to 1940s. This is kind of fun. This guy wrote, he sent it to somebody, and he put my work. Oops, my apologies there. My work, and he's got a little arrow drawing over to his little tiny building over there where he was working, which is kind of fun. Now, Air Maps was a company that produced aerial views of communities and industries, which they provided to governments, they provided them to townships, and they also produced postcards of them. They operated from the 19 teens to the 1940s, and they did frequently reproduce these in postcards. To the right, we have another aerial view, and that's from Sudbury News Services, as is the picture below, which is a picture of the mine. And those are from the 1960s. Now, in the early 50s, Inco built the nearby community of Lively, which in no way described activities in the community. It was named after Charles Lively, who was an early settler. So with Creighton Mine now beginning to show its age, many people chose to relocate to Lively with its new suburban-style homes and updated services. Creighton Mine's businesses slowly began to follow them, as the drugstore did, which I mentioned earlier. Creighton Mine continued to thrive for another couple of decades. By the 1970s, Creighton Mine's population had slipped from 2,000 a decade earlier to 1,000, with most residents relocating to Lively. Fires and demolitions took their toll, and by the early 80s, the population had dropped to about 600. The blows continued falling, and in 1986, Inco was hit with government orders to replace the aging sewage and water facilities. Now, the year had been less than profitable, and Inco was in no mood to spend $10 million making extensive infrastructure replacements, so they chose instead to close the existing town site. Residents were given 2 years to relocate. In 1988, with the town now completely abandoned, Inco bulldozed the remaining structures. Nothing remains other than roads, sidewalks, and cellar holes. Lively continues to thrive and is now part of the greater Sudbury area. So what Inco did was they erected this marble cairn with a plaque, which is very nice, okay? I mean, what it says, because the writing is not totally clear, dedicated to the people of Creighton Mine who formed a community of love, labor, and loyalty amongst these rocky hills. It is the spirit that gives life. On June 21st, 2020, the mine's current owner, who is Valet, broke records by holding the world's deepest underground concert 7,200 feet below the surface. Owing to pandemic restrictions, only 50 people were in attendance to listen to a 47-minute set played by the Shaft Bottom Boys. Money raised went to the Miners for Cancer and the summer science camps for children. The mine itself continues to produce. And here's a few views of what Creighton Mine looked like when I visited. As you can see, there are no buildings left. There's just the streets. There's stairways going to nowhere, a hosta garden that went wild. So there we are. I believe it is still accessible, but you can still get in there. The last community here is Depot Harbour. Now, Depot Harbour is located on Parry Island in the Georgian Bay. It's about 11 kilometers west of Parry Sound, which you can see on the map. It's accessible from the mainland by a bridge, which goes to Rose Point, which you can also see on the map. And we should also mention, this is very important, that Parry Island is owned by the Wissahickon First Nations, so be sure and visit the band office for permission to explore the area. I went there, they gave me a tour, they were wonderful. Now, Depot Harbor was started by John Rodolphus Booth, who was born in 1827, died in 1925. He was a fascinating character, and I'm actually really surprised that nobody has written a book or a bio on this man because he was a very, very interesting person. He was born in Shefford County, Waterloo, Quebec. His family were farmers and they came from the north of Ireland. As a child, he used to build little water wheels which turned by using water from a small stream on his father's property. He trained as a carpenter and later a machinist, and we know he had a grade six education. I'm not sure that he went beyond that. Booth went on to build and control the largest lumber empire in North America. This included timber limits, mills, and a transportation network that was comprised of the Canada Atlantic Railway and shipping lines. He got his start in Ottawa when he won the bid to supply lumber for the construction of the new Parliament buildings. And by relying on teams of horses rather than oxen, he was able to cut his costs and beat his competitors. His competitive success was built on having lowest transportation costs. So his goal was to have the shortest route to the Great Lakes from his mills in Ottawa. And so to achieve this, he planned to shave off 800 miles, thereby creating the shortest shipping route to the Great Lakes. As a businessman and an employer, Booth was well liked and respected by his competitors, his employees, and residents of the communities he served. He was a tough businessman, but he was also highly regarded for his honesty. There was a great deal of community loyalty towards John Booth, and it was kind of interesting because a number of years ago I was working with a gentleman that grew up in that area, and we were working on another ghost town. Not it was not Depot Harbor, and he kept referring to the Booth Railway, and he was born long after John Booth had passed on. So just the amount of loyalty that the community had towards this man was very interesting. So the Canada Atlantic Railway began as several incomplete railways. A couple were regional railways that Booth had built himself. He picked up a few other incomplete railways at fire sales, joined them all together. When completed, the line ran for 130 miles from Ottawa to the Georgian Bay and directly to the Great Lakes. It was officially completed in January 1897. So Parry Sound residents, it should be noted, were thrilled at the prospect of the railway's arrival, which would give them direct access to Ottawa. It didn't happen. Booth noted the facilities at Parry Sound would require regular dredging. As well, he was put off by the fees for dock space, which he believed were too high, and there were reports of property owners, jacking up their prices in anticipation of the railway. Well, anyway, but Booth needed a town site to set up his rail and shipping facilities, so instead he set his sights on Parry Island, just off the mainland, which also boasted the deepest natural harbor in Canada. So Parry Island, as I mentioned, was deeded to the Wissahickon First Nation back in the 1800s. Laws in effect at the time allowed for the expropriation of native-owned land for railway purposes. So in 1897, Booth obtained 314 acres of land on Parry Island that was followed by an additional 100-acre parcel in 1899 for a town site. He reportedly paid $9 an acre for the land, which, I don't know, maybe it was a fair price at the time. The land later ended up in CN's hands. Now, Booth named his little kingdom Depot Harbor, and it was additionally planned for up to 300 people. In the initial phase, there were 89 single and double family dwellings were constructed along with a boarding house, a town hall, post office, general store, butcher shop, and the railway buildings. It was followed by 3 churches, a school for primary students only, and a 110-room hotel. So to get to Depot Harbor, the railway built a swing bridge, and it was said to have been built in 1888 or 1899, but the government sources cite 1895, which seems more likely since the bridge was built primarily for rail traffic. Originally, it was known as the Rose Point Swing Bridge. It was replaced in 1912 with a new bridge that was designed to accommodate automobiles. That bridge is now known as the Wissahickon Swing Bridge. It's owned and maintained by the Government of Canada Indigenous Services and operated by the Wissahickon First Nations. And I included this picture up here only because it's extremely rare to see railway cars that actually have the Canada Atlantic reporting mark. And we'll find out why in a few moments. To the left, we have a photo of the Canada Atlantic Railway staff. That's from 1898, and that's from the National Archives. Below that, we have a photo from the Foley Historical Group from 1902, so we can see Depot Harbour here in the background. And we can see the Canada Atlantic Railway in the foreground over here. Now, Booth formed the Canada Atlantic Transit Company on both sides of the border, and the two companies owned a total of 7 steamships. By 1899, a little over 35% of the railway's traffic was lumber, and about 35% was grain, for a total of 70%. The remainder was other commodities such as livestock, feed, flour, and packaged goods. And although Booth was his own biggest customer, the Canada Atlantic also carried lumber for other mills along the route. The grain trade was particularly lucrative. Initially, the grain elevators were built for a capacity of 1 million bushels of grain. That was expanded by an additional million bushels in 1907. In 1910, Booth's lines were shipping 100 to 120 carloads of grain daily, and the harbor was often full with 3 or 4 ships waiting to be unloaded. Facilities included the usual coal and ore docks, warehouse. The railway facilities included coal chutes, a water tower, rail office, roundhouse, turntable, and station. So in addition to the elevators, there were shipping facilities, which included 2 huge freight sheds, a double-track trestle to access the elevators, a platform that could accommodate up to 4 steamers, powerhouses, powerhouse, coal docks, ore docks, and offices. Now, both of these cards are fairly common. The ship over here, actually, again, if you zoom in on it, it was the SS Arthur Orr. Now, you will note over here that it says Grand Trunk Elevators. This is a later card. It was mailed in 1909. And yes, that is what happened. In 1905, Booth sold the railway to the Grand Trunk, which of course later became merged into the CN. He retained ownership of the shipping operation, however. Now, Booth's reasons for selling are murky. There was talk of political influence because the federal government had invested heavily in the Grand Trunk. Other reasons could have been the overbuilding of railways, which Booth, as an astute businessman, would have been well aware of, or the fact that the Canada Atlantic by then needed a considerable amount of costly rehabilitation, which Booth may not have been prepared to do. Booth's lumber facilities had also sustained a devastating amount of damage due to a recent fire in Ottawa. Now, the railway was never a moneymaker for him. It was simply a means to an end. He actually took a $4 million hit when he sold the railway, and interestingly, the site wasn't ratified by Parliament until 1915. On the left, this is a beautiful aerial view here, which was probably taken from the top of one of the elevators. It was mailed in 1915, and you can see the roundhouse over here, and you can see this is the hotel over here, which we'll look at very shortly. To the right is the schoolhouse, and the school only covered the primary grades, so high school students had to commute by train to Sprucedale. Now, this was a railway community. There was a train every 20 minutes, so that wasn't too much of a problem. Now, the school and the hotel both appear on Gode's fire insurance map from 1899, which you can find at the National Archives. The school was located at the north end of the community. By 1911, the population had grown to over 600, rivaling that of Parry Sound. This necessitated the opening of a few more businesses, including another store and butcher shop. Unlike most communities, which were hard hit economically by World War I, Depot Harbour continued to boom. According to some sources, the population grew until finally reaching 1,500 residents. In 1917, construction began on an additional 5 blocks. The population reportedly peaked at 1,600 in 1926. The numbers, which included transient workers, swelled to an estimated 3,000 during the summer months, when shipping was at its peak. And the elevators and sheds operated from 12 to 18 hours per day. Now, this hotel would have been likely very useful in accommodating some of those transient workers. There are two views of the hotel. The one in the upper right appears to be the older view, and you can see a little bit of this building on the right that might have been the station. Yeah, you can see the farmers, few cows off to the side. This appears to be a later view of the hotel because you can see there's shrubbery over here, and it just got a little bit more of a settled finish look to it. And it was probably a very nice hotel. It was part of Booth's original plans, and it had 110 rooms. So, anyway, these are a couple of the postcards I've got of Depot Harbour. All the others are the churches. So, the St. John's Anglican Church is in the upper left. That's a lithograph. It's not a very good one, oops, my apologies there. It's not a very good one, as you can see the word postcard bleeding through from the back, but it's all we've got, so it is what it is. That was St. George's Anglican Church. It was built in 1902 on land donated by the railway. Other donations included 2,000 feet of lumber and $40 worth of shingles from Booths, so I guess they were Anglicans. Below that, this is a scan that was given to me by a friend of mine of the Roman Catholic Church. It was called the Sacred Heart Roman Catholic Church, and there's very little information available about it other than the fact that it is believed to have stood until the 1950s. To the right, we have the Childerhouse Memorial Presbyterian Church that was first established in 1899. It became the Childerhouse Memorial United Church in 1925. And interestingly, items from the abandoned United Church in Byng Inlet, the St. Andrew's Church, were later moved to this church. These are from a group of photos that were sent to me by somebody who grew up in Depot Harbour. And they're just nice family photos. They're dated from the early 1940s, is what he told me. And so, you can see all the buildings and whatnot, and you can see what it actually looked like as a community. Now, here's where things began going wrong. In 1923, the government rolled the bankrupt Grand Trunk into the newly created Canadian National Railway. In 1925, about 2 months before the death of J.R. Booth, CN applied to close the railway facilities in Depot Harbour and consolidate all the facilities into newer buildings on the mainland, just south of Parry Sound. The shipping facilities remained intact, and nothing much changed in the short term other than the railway facilities were shut down. The tracks remained in operation. Then, in 1933, a bridge in Algonquin Park was seriously damaged by an ice flow which forced CN to shut down the line. The government refused CN's request for a loan to repair the bridge. The government was building a highway in Algonquin Park as part of a relief project, and it followed the same route as the railway. With a price tag of $500,000, they saw no need to duplicate transportation services. So CN rerouted the grain shipments up to North Bay and cut access to Depot Harbour and the shipping facilities. The abandonment began shortly after that. This is a photo from the Parry Sound Public Library. I'm not sure if these are broken windows in this building over here or it's just reflections. It's been hard to tell, but you can see the place is looking pretty overgrown and pretty disheveled. But you can see the Catholic Church here in the background, which is kind of interesting. During the first part of World War II, other companies leased the elevators from time to time to store wheat and other shipments. By 1943, the elevators were empty. The freight sheds and elevators were turned over to the federal government. Australian wool, for some reason, was stored in the sheds. The elevators were used by the Defence Industries plant at Nobel, which was owned by Canadian Industries Limited, or CIL, where they stored cordite, which was a highly explosive munition that was used in the war effort. On September 13, 1944, CN issued a public announcement in the Montreal Gazette calling for tenders for the demolition of the elevators at Depot Harbour. The deadline was set for 12:30 p.m., September 26. Well, the end took place almost a year later, on August 14, 1945. Depot Harbour's elevators, which were full of cordite at the time, were destroyed in a massive blaze and explosion. There are a number of stories on how the fire started. One rather humorous one points to a fireworks display for VJ Day that got out of hand. Another source mentions two men reportedly seen running from the elevators just before the fire started. Now, interestingly, CN had been in discussion with a coal company prior to the destruction of the elevators, and they were unable to come to a deal because of the cost of dismantling the elevators. So one is left wondering. Nobody really knows what happened. It was said the fire was so bright. Remember, this fire took place at midnight. The people as far away as Parry Sound were able to read a newspaper by the lights. But one thing everyone agreed upon was that Depot Harbor was finished. During the 1950s, most of Depot Harbor's houses were sold to cottagers or to residents on the reserve. Those that weren't sold were dismantled and sold for materials. The Anglican Church had closed in 1937. The United Church lasted until 1952. One store continued to operate into the 1950s. The post office closed in 1955. Several industries used the area for a while. Those included the Century Coal Company and the Moose Mountain Mine, which used the harbor facilities for shipping for a couple of decades. Most of the railway trackage was lifted by 1960. In 1987, the land was returned to the Anishinaabe First Nations. So here's a few views of the remains of Depot Harbor. There aren't any dwellings or anything like that left. I had to laugh. I didn't know what this was called. It's called a mooring bollard. So I don't have much knowledge of nautical stuff. That is a mooring bollard. I'm not sure what these facilities were used for, but they were all close to the water. On the left here, we have the remains of the roundhouse, which I think a lot of it is still standing. And at the bottom right are the steps to the Roman Catholic Church. So that is it, folks. There's my website address if anyone wants to learn more about these communities.